Ko whakapūnaki tōku maunga, ko te wairoa tōku awa, ko Ngāti Kahungunu tōku iwi, ko kāinga ki te Waitati. Kei te Otago whakaihu waka au e mahi ana. Ko Christine Winter tōku ingoa. Ka mahi atu ahua ki te iwi Lenape, I'm not sure about the pronunciation of that, ki tēnei whenua. Nō rewa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So good afternoon, or maybe evening. What I've just done is introduce you to my ancestor mountain, my ancestor river, to my political unit, Ngāti Kahungunu. I've told you that I work at the University of Otago and that I live in a little settlement called Waitati. And I've paid my acknowledgements to the First Nations people of this land. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and thank you too to the wonderful folk at MOTH who are just sort of scattered everywhere, as moths should be, for providing me with this opportunity to visit. So I'm going to talk to you today about sand. Okay, sand. Just ordinary old sand. Why? Because I think it can be used to represent what we might think of as inconsequential in rights and justice. I suspect that when you folks think about these concepts, rights and justice, your vision is to expand their context maybe to animals, perhaps other living things like plants. But today I'm going to think with you about a radically expansive view of multi-species justice and more than human rights. Got to get this one right. Nah. Right, we're working. So I'm drawing from a Maori worldview, a relational way of knowing the world. We understand that everything is related, animal, including humans, vegetable, mineral, elemental, and spiritual. That no individual can flourish unless all the other components of the extended community are flourishing. And that it's our human obligation to support non-human flourishing. I'm not actually going to detail Maori philosophy specifically, but I will try to explain why I think that in matters of multi-species justice and more than human law, there can't be an elaborate hierarchy of beings, nor distinctions between living and non-living, sentient and non-sentient, matter and element, form and spirit. And I'm using sand to make that case. So I want to divert your gaze from sand as inconsequential. The question I'm asking is, can sand be a subject of multi-species justice and more than human rights? And I'll argue that indeed it can, and I'll try to demonstrate that relationality can and should be the ground of the idea of justice. During this MOTH Festival, the speakers are drawing you towards a capacious understanding of who and what matters within the spheres of justice. Political theories of justice are just slightly different to the legal ideas of justice. So justice in the political sense maps out the boundaries of political and institutional power so that all members of society are treated fairly. And I am aware that the boundaries and the checks and the balances are being ripped asunder at the moment in this country, and I am sorry. A multi-species theory of justice and more than human rights is radically inclusive. Consequently, it's important that we're not drawn into the argument that goes something like, we need to solve the social justice issues before we consider multi-species justice. To that sort of challenge, I say, current ideas of justice are misdirected. And they are misdirecting us all because justice theory is focused on the individual human being. I'm suggesting that political justice theory's attention has been and is misdirected. So one of the goals of multi-species justice and more than human rights is a reorientation of moral direction. To be clear, it's not to an individual grain of sand, sorry folks, that is the subject of justice. Rather, it's the relationships that are embedded on and alongside, around, and within the sand that are the subject. My argument is that justice theory's obsession with the individual has deflected theory and subsequent processes of law and the foundations of politics in society away from what is. In a desire to protect human subjects from domination, justice has been misdirected away from the relationships that sustain life and the planetary system. And so we as in everyone and everything, all, although not equally, face extinction, systemic collapse, and elemental chaos. I think we can understand sand as justice-worthy because it is a crucial member of a complex of relationships, some of which matter directly to humans, many of which, at first blush, may not seem to matter at all, not at all. I suggest justice is owed to the relationships that inhere and adhere to sand. So I've begun to define justice now, and for clarity, by multi-species, I mean human beings, animals, insects, reptiles, fish, cephalopods, plants, lichens, mosses, fungi, water, land and landforms, seas, air and elements, and the metaphysical. There's probably something I've missed out in that list. So for brevity, therefore, let's say I include humans and everything else that constitutes the community of planetary being. That is living, elemental, and metaphysical. I could now discuss a whole lot of stuff about justice theories, but I've got a feeling if I did, you'd stand up and walk away. So let's just think together with sand. So sand is not a thing in the sense that it is of uniform composition. Sand is simply defined by grain size. And I want to tell you a story to illustrate this point. I grew up in an area where the sand is black. It's so dark, it will burn and blister the soles of your feet on a hot summer day. It's black because the source material is from volcanic lava, weathered and tumbled down streams and rivers, abraded and then crashed by crashing and roiling along the west coast of Aotearoa into its finest grains. These fine grains are predominantly iron, brought from the depths of the planet in eruptions of ages past. Now, when I was 7 and 8, we had 2 summer holidays on a small island off the shores of Aotearoa. There, the home bay was white sand, but the next 2 bays along were really interesting. In the first, the sand was pink. In the next, it was green. And sadly, I don't have photos of that because those were pre-digital days. You can tell, this made a really big impression on the young me. I'm remembering this from 60-odd years ago. The pink sand was mainly composed of crab, rock lobster, and scallop shells. And I know that because we gathered all 3 from the waters off that bay. All these creatures are red, and they fade to pink in the sun once the creature no longer inhabits their shell, or once they've died or shed their shells. The green sand was mainly kina. Kina is a sea urchin. And when alive, they are red. But when they die, their shells turn to green. And they were everywhere in the rock pools by that beach. So each beach, the black sands of Taranaki, the white sands of Home Bay, and the following two of pink and green, wore their geological and their interspecies relationships in their colours. So these are the first sets of relationships sand has, relationships of origin, elemental relationships with the Earth's core, with the moments of creation, with the basic matter that forms this habitable planet. Relationships with eruptions, rains and rivers, tides and pounding waves. Relationships too with the creatures who live on and in the matter of the foreshore and the seabed. Creatures who die, or then die in situ, and become sand in and on which their kin live and die and become sand. So sand is only sand because it exists within relationships between matter and elemental forces. Sand is also home. I've suggested already that some creatures make sand their home: crabs, scallops, sandhoppers, sea worms, seaweeds, lounging sea lions, all manner of life forms nestle into the sand as home, refuge, or warm and cozy sleeping place. It's an essential relationship for these beings. Without sand, there is no home. There is no place to stand, to breed, to perform their life projects, to flourish and to die. Sand is an essential element in their ability to exist. So while inanimate, while it may not know in a human sense of knowing that it is a home, that does not, I suggest, diminish the essential significance of sand as home. The next layer of relationships is that of sustenance. While sand may be a safe haven, the home of many creatures, it's also a larder for a whole bunch more. There we find a relationship between the sand and the birds that strut the tidal zone in search of food. And it's a larder for humans too. So we go to the sand to dig for shellfish at low tide. And for some, that's for your own evening feast. For others, it constitutes a livelihood. So here, sand is entering a relationship with humans. Beach sands have a relationship too with the sea and the land. The beach and the dunes form a buffer between the two, between land and sea. They protect the land from erosion, or at least they did. Climate change is one of those elements of the polycrisis that is changing coastal conditions to the point that now sand is eroding more quickly than it can be replaced. Human activity has upset the balance of these relationships, and I'm suggesting that is actually an injustice. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about sand as a resource for construction. Stop and think about your encounters with sand today. The road, the sidewalk, the mortar holding bricks together in these university buildings, in apartment blocks, in monuments, in seawalls. Modern cities are built from sand. This is for you, McNear. Sand is deeply embedded in human society. It has a relationship with society. Ironically, given sand's general abundance, the special sort of sand used in construction is actually on the point of complete exhaustion. Because of the growing supply issues, there are now a host of oppressions to marginalised human communities arising from its extraction. So there are direct social justice issues embedded in the extraction of sand. So have I convinced you? Have I convinced you that sand is relational? Now, I have to convince you that those relationships should be regarded as the subjects of justice. So sand's role in flourishing. Let's think about sand as essential to the flourishing of a multiple and animate and inanimate things. Marine and terrestrial, avian, crustacean, mammalian beings, vegetative matter, and the stuff of the coastal and inland landforms. And finally, urban human existence. All these things are utterly dependent on sand. Sand is, as we talked earlier about, the result of natural processes. Crustal formation, landform erosion, aquatic, riverine, lake and coastal processes, and aeolian processes. Sand exists because of and within a whole complex of relationships, each in its own way important to life on Earth, to earthly flourishing in all the possible ways that we can consider earthly flourishing might be expressed. When moral human beings, or immoral human beings for that matter, regard sand as inanimate and, ironically, immaterial, they do a violence to that basket of relationships. Sand is not just sand. Sand is just not individuated grains. Each insignificant grain of sand is significantly in relation with other grains, its context, and a teeming mass of beings from the even more microscopic than the grains of sand themselves, through to the lazing sea lions and the romping frolics of family picnics. It is in the relationality of sand, it is the relationality of sand that gives it moral significance. It is its relationship that gives it its potential to be, a liveliness, if you will. It is in the multiple relationships of this liveliness that make sand a site of flourishing that generates the obligations and duties of justice. And to be absolutely clear here, sand owes us nothing. It is humans who bear the responsibility to sand as a relational object. So here I've tempted you to think with sand, to focus on the obligations of justice, to focus the obligations of justice on relationships and relationality. I've asked you to consider that all things, including us, sit within and exist because of multiple relationships, from the elemental to the material, to sustenance, life-giving and creation, and the metaphysical. And I'm suggesting it is that complex that generates human obligations and duties to attend to the flourishing of those relationships. The focus of justice then becomes enhancing flourishing, not of an individual, be that an individual human or a grain of sand, but rather to the multiple relationships embedded with any individual. So that, just to round off, doesn't require that humans cease to use the materials of the environment to afford their own flourishing, but rather that we do so mindful of the relationships that might be disrupted in that use. What is required is a level of attention to the totality of systems that make Earth habitable, the climate amenable, and society somewhat equitable, that have been subverted by the reification of the human, and a reification that has condensed relationality to domination, toil, and the dollar. Tēnā koutou, thank you.